Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Gordon Ingram. He is Associate Professor of Psychology at Universidad de Los Andes, Colombia. He teaches undergraduate courses in Developmental Psychology, Cyberpsychology, and Psychology of Language, and a graduate course in Cognition and Culture. He supervises several graduate students researching children's social and moral development. His research centers on children's and adolescents' everyday communication online. So, Dr. Ingram, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
No problem. Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Okay, great. So basically today we're going to talk a little bit about some topics coming from developmental evolutionary psychology, right? So would you say that perhaps your work focuses a lot on social and emotional learning in children? Is that your main focus or?
Yeah, more narrowly, children's social interactions with other children mostly, and in terms of their everyday communication. So how they kind of use everyday communication to learn about the social world, social norms, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's very interesting. And I would like to ask you first, what is the earliest age where children already exhibit what we could call social behavior or social learning, or at least something that resembles it?
Well, I think from pretty much from birth, really, you can see. In fact, you could even argue that before birth, children are don't want to get into too much of a debate about whether they're sort of fully persons before birth, but there is some kind of in late pregnancy there is some kind of responsiveness to pressure on the abdomen, the mother's abdomen, that sort of thing. They respond to sounds. So I remember my partner, when she was pregnant with our daughter, telling me that she went to see a Pirates of the Caribbean film, and when they had sort of stirring emotional scenes with lots of music, that she could feel the baby sort of kicking and things. So babies are always responsive to the social world. From birth, they orientate naturally towards faces. So, and this seems to be, in evolutionary terms, an adaptation to learn about people's emotions, so that they're very oriented towards looking at their caregivers' faces, so they can see their caregiver's emotional response to a social situation, like a threat or something which is pleasurable. And they seem to have this instinct to get this emotional connection with the people around them from as far back as we can measure it, really, in terms of age.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting, because I think that most people would think that we can only talk about social interaction or the ability for children to socialize, let's say, when they are in a stage of development where they can already use language and they can already reciprocate, at least to a certain extent. But it seems then that socialization in children occurs from the very stage where they are able to establish any sort of social interaction with people and also process social information coming from other people. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite topics when I'm teaching developmental psychology, I do kind of early on a class on the sort of precursors of language. So how children have these social and emotional interactions that are pre-linguistic. There's a famous experiment by Edward Tronick called the still face experiment. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's basically the mother, and usually a mother could be a father as well, or any caregiver, but the mother and the baby are interacting. This is typically with 5, 6, 7-month-old babies. And so they're just, sort of playing, sort of interacting, looking at each other's faces. And then the mother is asked to basically not respond to the baby. So she'll just do this still face, just not responding. And the baby very quickly gets agitated. So it seems like we're kind of, it'll start trying to attract the mother's attention, and it won't be happy again until the mother's paying attention. Eventually, it might lose interest and it starts looking. It's a brilliant video that I always show in my class because it really illustrates this very clearly. And the baby just sort of loses interest eventually and it's kind of sad because it looks kind of depressed. And then the mother, starts interacting with it again, and it's all happy again and starts interacting with the mother. So it seems like we're programmed to enjoy these reciprocal interactions, and even before the baby can speak, it's looking for these responses and these contingent responses from the caregivers. And it's easy to see how that, whether that is actually designed by evolution for us to help us acquire language is an interesting debate. I think how much is it a specific adaptation to learn language through these reciprocal interactions, and how much did language maybe just build on top of that kind of pattern of relationship that was already there? It's very hard to answer that question, obviously, but it does seem that we are sort of prepared in some way to acquire language through this enjoyment of reciprocal interactions and paying attention directly to the other person's face and so on.
Mm-hmm. So could you say that children are already born with certain expectations about the social world they will be interacting with?
Expectations? I don't know. I think expectations might be a bit too strong, because you've always got this problem of people use words which sound like they involve consciousness in some way. I don't know, maybe a bit later we could talk about the difference between implicit and explicit reasoning, which I think is very interesting as well. But yeah, I don't know if it's expectations, but there's definitely, I would probably use the term sort of attentional biases. So there's definitely an attentional bias towards looking at people's faces, getting that sort of information. Also looking at the hands. So in fact, if you look at a baby's typical sort of eye movements, they'll go back and forth between the face and the hands. So they can see what people are doing, and they can see how people are reacting emotionally to what they're doing, which I think is very important. Like sometimes we get a bit too hung up on the faces and forget about there's also this bias to look at the hands. I remember Linda Smith giving a talk where she was talking about this, and it's in terms of expectations or these attentional biases. I think there's an evaluation of actions. So you might be familiar with Kylie Hamlin's famous experiments where she looked at infants' attention towards helping and hindering behaviors. So she showed babies pictures of a character, an animated character, either helping another character or preventing it doing what it wanted in some way. And the children then prefer, the babies, this is before 1 year old, the babies prefer to interact with the character when they're given the chance to play with the toy afterwards. They prefer to interact with the character that was helping the other characters. So they do seem to have this bias towards responsive, helpful kind of agents, and this will then affect their behavior. But yeah, I would probably say expectation sounds a bit too strong to me. Yeah.
Right. So that experiment that you just described, that I remembered after your description, let's say, it already points to an incipient form of moral development in those babies, right? Because, I mean, they are sort of morally evaluating the actions, in that case, of certain forms. I think that in some experiments it's just a triangle or a square or something like that they use, and they're treating it like if they were agents. Right?
Yes. They seem to be interpreting, I mean, very early on babies seem to show a difference in how they look at agents' behavior and how they look at objects, inanimate objects' behavior. So there's other experiments, I think by Bellageon, where she shows that children expect an agent to go around an obstacle, but they don't expect an inanimate object that's just been pushed or something to go around the obstacle. So they differentiate very early on between how agents behave and how inanimate objects behave. Sometimes in the context of the moral judgment, that can be phrased in terms of reciprocity. So the idea would be that the child is sort of punishing the character that was harming or hindering the other character by not playing with it. I think that might be a bit too strong as well. I mean, there is maybe some sort of moral evaluation there. You could say it's the start of moral evaluation, but Whether it's the start of punishment, I think might be too strong, because I think it could just be that the baby's avoiding, they have an instinct to, if someone's not helping, you avoid them, you stay away from them, you don't want to approach them. So I don't know whether that would count as punishment. In my book it wasn't, but some people certainly interpreted it that way.
Right. And one very interesting aspect and important aspect here, I guess, is that in those very early stages of development, no one is teaching children how to evaluate things, right? They do that spontaneously.
Yeah, this is the thing, that a lot of people have the intuition that babies get all the kind of social evaluations and things from the culture around them, the caregivers. I think a lot of these experiments are showing it so early with babies. It's very implausible to me that they've actually acquired this kind of thing. Especially with some of the evidence with newborn babies, like I said, for preference for faces, there's just no way they could have culturally acquired that. And then if you allow them to have certain instincts for that sort of thing, then why couldn't they also have certain instinctual evaluations of positive and negative, etc.? And to me, it makes a lot more sense that these things would be instinctual, because those things could also drive learning. So if you're going to pay more attention to the people who are helping you, that makes a lot more sense to me. You don't just pay attention indiscriminately to all the humans around you. You focus on the people who are helping you, the people who are looking after you. So to me, they have to have some sort of differentiation inbuilt before they can actually start the cultural learning. I think that would be much more efficient in evolutionary terms.
Mm-hmm. So, because this occurs very early in children's development, it's already a very strong source of evidence for its innateness. I'm not sure if that's the best word to use here, but at least it seems that people are not teaching children how to think and to perceive these sorts of behaviors. They are spontaneously morally evaluating those behaviors by themselves. But has that research been replicated cross-culturally or not?
I'm not aware of any replications for the studies I've mentioned. Yeah, it would be something that would be very interesting to look at in terms of, I think they have been replicated, but I'm not aware of sort of real cross-cultural, like in ethnographic settings. I think there is some work on children's expression of emotions. So with the Paul Ekman kind of school of basic emotions, you can see, for example, children will smile from about 2 months. They can show fear, anger from about 4 to 6 months. Disgust, I think, is even earlier than smiling, almost from birth, certainly from 1 month. And I think there is plenty of evidence that that's cross-cultural. I mean, it's just implausible to me that could be learned. That what would impel a child, a 1 month or 2 month old baby, to learn an expression of disgust from a caregiver or learn a smile from a caregiver? To me, it has to be something innate that they're just spontaneously doing, and then it does become reciprocal. Obviously, they learn to kind of smile when someone else is smiling. That if someone else is showing fear, they pick up the fear as well. But these are sort of basic programs, I think, which are helping to scaffold the learning rather than being completely learned themselves.
Mm-hmm. And you do that by observing children's or babies' facial expressions. That is, those 6 basic facial expressions that Paul Ekman discovered occur cross-culturally. Right?
Yeah, there's experiments which show that adults in different cultures can effectively characterize a baby's emotional expressions based on the similarity to adult expressions. And they, of course, to do that, you have to know that the baby is really feeling something. So they would use photos where the baby's obviously been enjoying interactions with a mother, or to get the negative expressions, they actually, because it's a bit unethical to do an experiment where you induce negative emotion in the baby. So that they had a very clever technique, which was to work with babies who'd received vaccinations. So a baby who's just had a vaccination is obviously not a happy baby. So they take a photo of the facial expression and then find that people in other cultures can perfectly easily say this baby is not happy and this baby is angry. it's in pain or something like that. So yeah, there does seem to be a kind of common architecture, which is built around emotion recognition and expression. I have to say, I haven't done, this is all the stuff I teach in developmental psychology. I haven't done any experiments directly with babies myself. The youngest children I worked with would be just under 3 years old, about 3 years old. So.
Mm-hmm. And so later on, when children start using things like language, and they are already a little bit more independent, they can already walk and perhaps interact more with other children, they get into later stages of social development and social learning, let's say, right? And they started using tools like gossiping and tattling, and they get, at a certain point, they get really obsessed with norm violation. Right.
Yes. So that was basically the main topic of my PhD research, was children's tattling, which is, for people who are not familiar with the word, it's not the most common word in English, but it means something that children do when they tell what another. So they report on what another child has been doing, especially if it's something they don't like, basically, often a norm violation. And it's usually telling a more powerful figure, like a teacher or a parent, possibly an older brother, something like that. So, what I found was basically that when children were talking about other children's behavior, the main context that they were doing this was in terms of tattling. So they weren't just sort of gossiping, saying, "Oh, you know, Jane wore a nice sweater today," to their mother. They were talking, especially to teachers and parents, about the negative things that other children had done. So this was the main sort of relevance in other peers' behaviour seemed to be what they were doing when they were doing something that they didn't like. So when they were doing something, for example, not sharing a toy, or or pushing past them in a line, waiting to go into the wash their hands, for example, before lunch, or just knocking them over in the playground, something like that. So there were different kinds of activities, but often the way that they seemed to phrase these to the teacher in the preschools where I studied would be in terms of norm violation. So it was very clear that they were sort of saying, he did this and he shouldn't be doing this, or she did this and she shouldn't be doing this. For example, it could be some behaviors that didn't affect them directly. So they might say, Edward's under the table. So, a child had crawled under the table in the preschool, and the other child understood that they weren't supposed to do that. She's like, look, Edward's under the table, and sort of reporting his activity.
Mm-hmm. And when does that start happening in children's lives or development? When do exactly they start caring about norm violation?
Well, basically, I haven't studied this academically, but looking at my own kids, so I have had the experience of sort of working with, looking at my own 3 children's development, which has helped a lot with my professional sort of understanding of child development. I would say it's pretty much as early as children start communicating with adults at all. So in my own, I've got a 20-month daughter at the moment, and I remember an example a month or 2 ago where she'd been playing with a toy, and an older boy had sort of taken the toy off her, and she was looking at me, looking at my face, waving her arms, very obviously trying to attract my attention to what the other child had done. And that seems to me to be a very early form of tattling, like sort of attracting the attention. You don't see this in chimpanzees so much. Well, I think some people have argued that you do get something a bit similar in chimpanzees. Certainly, a baby chimpanzee might go and seek comfort from the mother if that sort of thing happens. If another chimpanzee took food off them or something like that. But it's not so unambiguous that you get this kind of attracting of attention. I think some people have argued for it in juvenile chimpanzees, but you certainly don't see it in adult chimpanzees anyway.
Right. And when we're talking about norms here, What kinds of norms exactly? Are they norms that derive directly from evolutionary mechanisms like reciprocal altruism, that is, rules of reciprocity that children spontaneously develop and they think others should follow? Or are they mainly norms that they derive from their cultural environment, or the third option, norms that they themselves develop by interacting with one another?
I think this is, it's a very interesting question. The majority of things that they were talking about were things that impacted them directly. So you might say, if you thinking in terms of like the moral conventional distinction in child psychology, you might say that the majority of them were moral ones, and very rarely about another victim. It was usually when someone had taken a toy off them, someone had injured them, but not actually injured them, but hurt them, made some physical contact that they didn't like. So this would be the sort of typical topics. But then there were some sort of more conventional norms, like the example of being under the table that I told you about, where it seemed to be the idea that, okay, we have these rules in the classroom, and if someone breaks a rule, then the teacher should know about it. So they do. I wouldn't say it was all children who were reporting on that kind of norm violation, but certainly some of the more dominant children in particular seem to be concerned about that sort of rule violation. So looking at, I did a sort of correlation. I measured the dominance of all the children in the classroom, and it was certainly tended to be the more dominant children who were doing the tattling. So I think that's, looking at the individual differences is quite interesting as well, because there's a lot of evidence generally from human societies that the more dominant individuals tend to be more oriented towards rules, towards upholding rules, punishing rule breakers, etc. And it could be that they're kind of using, even from this, 3-4 years old, they might be using breaking rules as a kind of, or reporting on breaking rules as a kind of competition, so that this is a chance to kind of get one over on the other child and decrease their reputation in the eyes of the teacher. That was the way I was saying it anyway.
Mm-hmm. I also asked you that because I don't know today if his work is still that relevant, but there were researchers like Piaget that studied how children interacted with one another, in a certain sense, how through interactions and by playing games they sort of developed spontaneous rules among themselves, that is, rules that were not explicitly stated a priori, but they, through iterated interactions, developed themselves. So I don't know to what extent that is relevant in children's moral development, let's say.
That would be, with the children that Piaget was studying, that would be slightly older, so between sort of 7 and 10 years old. I think he would see the start of this autonomous phase. So he distinguished between the heteronymous phase of morality, where children just accept adults' rules, and the autonomous phase where they can create their own ones. I think a lot of Piaget's ideas have more or less held up and been used to build, more recent theories. What has changed a lot is that we've realized that children can do a lot of these things a lot earlier than he thought. So they have competences a lot at ages that are a lot younger than he believed. So, for example, thinking of one of the examples from language development, which is Nicaraguan sign language, which is very interesting, where sort of 3-4-year-old children, when they started going to school, they synthesized their home sign systems and developed their own sort of set of rules and norms to govern, a whole grammar basically to govern their language use. So that would indicate that children might actually be able to develop these, assuming that in moral psychology it works around the same age, then they might be able to develop these systems of norms and rules a bit earlier than he thought, so maybe about 3-4 years of age. Whether they would report to adults on violations of those norms would be a really interesting question. Personally, I think they'd be more likely to report to other children, because they wouldn't see it as an adult concern. If they develop the rules themselves, they're probably not going to reporting real violations to the adults because they see it as their own rules and in their own context. But that would be a very interesting kind of research question to look at, whether they could develop these norm systems and then who they would report on violations to.
So, I mean, this is mostly based on intuitions and anecdotal evidence, but I remember when I was a child how it was so easy for me and my friends to simply start a new game, invent a new game, and then come up with a set of rules that we all agreed on without having them presented by adults or teachers or something like that. And I mean, I guess that can occur even earlier than the 7 to 10-year-old range that Piaget studied.
I would guess that it can, but I must admit I haven't seen any research showing that specifically. But it's a general pattern with Piaget's findings that when psychologists really try and push the ages down, they have been able to push them down a lot for most things. So I would expect that would happen for this as well. And it's certainly true that children pick up rules very easily. I mean, you're probably familiar with some of the experiments coming out of Tomasello's research group over the last few years, where they've shown that you can teach in the context of, say, playing a game with a puppet. You can say to the child, these are the rules, you're going to play this game with these toys or something like this. And then the puppet will come along and violate the rules. And the child will be like, no, like to the experimenter, no, he's doing it wrong. And shouting at the puppet and things, because even though they've only just learned the rule 10 minutes ago, to them it's something important that they have to follow it. So that, again, as with the emotional expressions, I would say that we probably have this kind of instinctual architecture for acquiring rules and expecting that there's some common pattern of behavior that has to hold between different people in the group. And then if it becomes a problem to us, if we see people violating those rules, I'm not saying that everyone would report violations, because I think it is very important that we have these individual differences as well, but certainly a lot of the children in the preschools were reporting these quite frequently to the teachers.
Mm-hmm. So you refer to the work by Tomasello, and I've already had Felix Warnken on the show, right. That is one of his collaborators, let's say. And it's interesting because they also do studies on other primates like chimpanzees. And I mean, I'm not sure if other primates also follow what we call rules in any way, or at least social rules, but there could also be a phylogenetic element to all of these here, or
yeah, it's it then can become quite a philosophical question, I think, like finding norms or rules in pre-linguistic contexts is very difficult. Like, we can all agree it's a norm when people say that it's a norm, that, oh, this is what we do, this is what you have to do, but how do you say that it's a norm before people can talk about it? Maybe it's just a habit, or some instinctive program that they're following. I suppose in chimpanzees, if someone could show that there were cultural differences, there's interesting work, I think, by Andrew Whiten and people like that on cultures in chimpanzees and cultural differences. So that might be one avenue that people could look at to show if there were kind of differences in behavior, practices, that this could represent some sort of cultural norms between chimpanzees. But I'm not aware of any sort of firm evidence that chimpanzees have norms in that way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now let's change topics and talk a little bit about cyberpsychology, because it's really a topic that I haven't yet explored a lot on my channel, and it's really fascinating. So, I mean, when you study cyberpsychology, what are you really trying to understand? Are you trying to understand how people interact socially, normally, let's say, trying to extrapolate from virtual interactions to real interactions, or simply trying to understand how the virtual world change people's interactions?
I think a lot of research has been focused on the latter, so looking at the differences between offline interactions and online interactions. What are the characteristics of online interactions that make it different from offline? ones. I think there may be a bit of a this sort of would have started in the 90s when people first started interacting online, and it would have been very text-based. So obviously text-based communication is very different from face-to-face communication. What has complicated that since then is that we've seen a huge rise, obviously, in voice-based and video-based communication, as we're in fact doing now. And there's not as many differences between that and offline communication as there is with text communication and offline communication. Text-based tends to be more asynchronous. The person can wait until a certain moment before they reply, or they can think over the response in their head and what they're going to say. So this creates a lot of differences which aren't necessarily there with kind of real-time video-based communication. And I think that there's maybe the start of a shift happening now in cyberpsychology, where people are less thinking in terms of what does the internet do, what does online communication do to change social relationships, and now starting to look at actually what are the differences between the various technologies that are available, the various ways in which people can communicate online. And I think that's very exciting because you can see just so many possible avenues for new research in there. But in terms of, I'm thinking about a recent article by Amy Orban at Oxford, which explored the effects of screen time on kids, and basically concluded, it's a huge data set, tens of thousands of teenagers, I think it was, and concluded there was virtually no effect of screen time, how much time people are spending online in general on well-being. And it's not surprising, really, because people could be doing all sorts of different things online. I mean, they could be doing, educational activities like watching your videos, or they could be, playing games. They could be just chatting with friends. They could be chatting with older relatives who live in different cities who they otherwise wouldn't be able to contact. So there's all sorts of positive and negative activities that people could be doing online. They could be gambling. They could be watching porn. So, just to lump it all together and say, online is good or bad just seems far too simplistic these days. And I think people are now starting to look at, well, what are the different kinds of activities people can do online and what different effects could they have, which is quite interesting to say.
Mm-hmm. Right, and I mean, in this case, it's really people trying to demonize technology and saying that the technology is what's causing mental issues, for example. Yeah. But I mean, since the internet is so vast, it's really difficult to say that simply by being in front of a computer or in front of a cell phone or something like that, that people are only doing things that are harmful to them.
Yeah. I think even measuring time online these days is very difficult. I wouldn't personally do that myself. I've started doing some research with sort of young adolescents in terms of internet use, and I would never ask a question like, how much time do you spend online? Because these days what is spending time online? If you're on WhatsApp, technically that's online, but people are just chatting as if it's a text message. It's just the same as a text message, really. And if people are watching Netflix, technically that's online, but it's just like watching TV. What's the difference between watching Netflix and watching TV? There isn't really much difference. So it's, I think, that certainly the academics, there's a tendency in the media still, the traditional media, to say online is bad, and people are addicted to their cell phones. They can't sleep because they're looking at their cell phones before they go to bed, and this sort of thing. And most of the academics in the field seem to be quite opposed to that sort of position. Say, actually, there's not much secure evidence for any of this. This is all just sort of cultural kind of panic. You can say whenever there's a new technology, that going back to the ancient Greeks, that you get these cultural panics about what it's doing, especially to young people. And people say things like, "Oh, how can you shouldn't let a child near a cell phone? Children shouldn't have their own cell phone." So I said, well, adults have cell phones. You're worried about children getting addicted to cell phones, but as adults, we're already addicted to cell phones. I mean, they're just going to grow up the same as us, really. It doesn't seem anything to panic about to me.
Yeah, I mean, throughout human history, people always demonized new technology. Even Socrates demonized books, and so I guess that it's just some sort of moral panic,
But
particularly that older people have.
it's interesting that it always seems to be connected with young people. That's the fear that somehow, I don't know. It seems to be this fear that people have. It's not a fear that I've ever had, so it's quite difficult for me to understand it. But a lot of people seem to have this fear that the young people will grow up with a completely different culture than the previous generations, and it's interesting. Maybe there is some kind of you could imagine that there may be some kind of cultural selectionist logic going on there, that you want to preserve your culture, so you want to keep your children kind of with the same norms, same rules of behavior that you have, and you're worried about them sort of being taken over by another culture. So I think that's very speculative, but it would certainly explain that kind of fear that people have of new technology, especially in connection with young people.
Mhm. Or perhaps older people feel threatened by the fact that they can no longer understand
Yeah.
how people interact in the new world, let's say.
Exactly. If you don't understand the rules and the technology that they're using, then you can't control their behavior. So, yeah, that's certainly connected with it.
So, I mean, should we approach each type of technology in a case-by-case basis? That is, should we deal with, for example, video games differently than we deal with pornography and social media and dating websites and other things? Or do they all have perhaps common features?
Or even within different types of video games. I mean, it's such a vast area. There's research on a lot of research trying to find out whether video games cause aggression, and it's so variable because some people would just look at video games in general, other people would look at violent video games. I think some of the most recent research indicates that it may not actually be violent video games as such that could increase aggression, but more competitive video games. So if someone has been playing a sports game, they may feel just as aggressive afterwards as someone who's playing a shooting game. But if they've been playing more of a cooperative kind of puzzle-solving game, they're not going to show that kind of aggression afterwards. So yeah, it's very fine-grained. And in terms of the theories, I think there's a real need in cyberpsychology. That's why I'm trying to develop an approach of evolutionary cyberpsychology, because there's a real absence of kind of organization to the theories. There's some theories saying anonymity is important, lack of direct emotional feedback could be important. So there's a lot of interesting theories in the area, but there's nothing sort of really tying them together and saying, well, this would explain why certain type of activity is good, other type of activity is bad, and so on.
Mm-hmm. And could it make sense that in virtual social interaction, since people don't have access to the rich environments that they have if they're talking face to face, I mean, they don't have access to the vocal tone, they don't have access to facial expressions, to body disposition and things like that, that if very young children start getting too much into the virtual worlds, into virtual social media and things like that, that they might lose something when they're developing their social skills, their social aptitudes, or something like that?
I think that's definitely a fear that a lot of people have these days. Personally, I would be skeptical of that, because I think if children have the chance to look at technology with other children, that's how children prefer to do it. If you look at any child, they're going to prefer kind of looking at a game on a cell phone with another child and kind of talking about what's going on than just doing it by themselves. So it's really more about, I think there's this sort of negativity about children spending too much time on video games and so on. In the past, it would have been children spending too much time watching TV, which is pretty much the same idea. And at least you can argue that with games, it's more active. At least they're doing something and not just passively watching something. But I think a lot of the research on well-being, like the study I talked about by Amy Orban a few minutes ago, is showing that actually the positive things are more important. So giving children opportunities to go and play sports, to go outside, mix with other children in the outdoors, to go to museums, get interesting cultural experiences, go on holidays. This is the sort of thing that actually affects well-being more than the amount of time that they're just spending playing video games and things. So if they're still getting all those other opportunities, you don't really have to worry about too much about how much time they're spending on games. And they are usually using these as social connections. I mean, I have two teenage sons, and they play Fortnite, they play Overwatch, but they play them socially. They are there in groups of friends. They know some of the people they know offline, some of the people they only know online, but they're definitely in social groups, and they're learning things. They're learning about how to work as a team. So I would argue that they're still getting lots of opportunities to get social information from these kinds of interactions, as long as their parents do give them those opportunities and don't just sort of shut them in the house all the time and never give them the opportunities to go out and meet other people.
Mm-hmm. And there might also be some confounding factors here, right? So, for example, perhaps the children that tend to spend the most time online are also the ones that are more introverted, and perhaps they prefer those sorts of activities. So we also have to try to control for inter-individual variation in terms of people's and children's preferences and things like that.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and it's one of the curses of developmental psychology is, finding cause and effect is very difficult, because you always get these, it's very easy to find correlations in developmental psychology, but it's much less easy to say one is causing the other, that all this time they're spending online is a cause of their depression, say, and not an effect of depression, because it could easily be that depressed people are more likely to stay at home, and therefore their only way of communicating with other people is to go on Facebook, to go on Twitter, etc., etc. And who's to say, without doing a proper longitudinal causally oriented study, you can't say that these people are actually worse off than if Facebook didn't exist. Maybe if Facebook wasn't there, the person would still be staying at home, not seeing other people, but they'd be buried in books or watching TV. And actually, maybe having Facebook and Instagram is a way of connecting with other people, which could be making them a bit less depressed than they would otherwise be.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes specifically to social media, there are lots of people who have this argument that goes like this, that they notice that people on social media like Facebook and Twitter seem like they are nastier than in real life because of issues related to anonymity and because they don't have direct feedback from the other person. Yes. Or something like that. They don't feel physically threatened, at least directly, and so it's a bit more difficult for them to regulate their behavior on the internet. Does that make sense, or?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of studies showing that. There's basically two things theoretically which are important. One is the anonymity, which means that people aren't as concerned about their reputation. So they think, well, it's not going to affect my job, it's not going to affect my relationship with my wife or my social context, so I don't really care what these people think of me online. And people can even, you could argue that possibly for some people it could even be healthy that they're taking out their aggression on strangers rather than people close to them. I'm not sure I would say that myself, but I could imagine some people arguing that. And then the other one is, like you say, the idea of it's called reduced cues theory. So where people aren't getting the same emotional feedback from the people that they're interacting with, so they maybe don't realize how much they're upsetting the other person because they can't see the other person actually crying on the other side of the computer, which must happen a lot. And so I think you've got both dimensions there, a sort of explicit dimension that people aren't worried about their reputation, and then the implicit emotional dimension that people aren't sort of feeling the sense of pity almost for the other person, which would inhibit them from continuing to be aggressive. And I think it would be very interesting, it's not something I've seen anyone do so far, but to really categorize different forms of interacting online and say which one's higher in anonymity, which one's higher in reduced cues, and then sort of make predictions about how that could affect the amount of trolling and aggression that people get. That's just sort of given me some interesting ideas for some research designs now. I think that would be really cool to look at, actually.
Yeah, that would be great. And I mean, we're talking about how people interact in social media, and I guess that we talked about anonymity and things like that, and people not having access to social cues as much, at least. And I mean, it's not really people's fault. They don't do that consciously. I mean, they are not nastier at a conscious level. They don't decide to do that, or I mean, is it the environment they are interacting in that causes for them to adopt that sort of behavior? Or
well, I think there's two types of trolling, really. It's similar to some of the literature on bullying in children. So I think historically there was always this attitude that bullies were kind of socially inept. They didn't realize how much they were hurting the other person. And then actually some studies, sort of starting with Alwius and people like that back in the 80s and 90s, they realized that a lot of bullies were actually quite Machiavellian and actually quite sadistic, and they quite enjoyed, they were perfectly aware that they were causing pain to the other child. That was why they did it, basically, because they enjoyed it. And I think you probably have some of the same thing going on with trolls. So you get some interactions where people are accused of being a troll, but they're actually just, they've got quite angry about what someone else is saying, and then they're just kind of and sort of ranting at the other person. But then there's other ones who definitely are out there to make trouble, and they really enjoy just getting a reaction from other. I'm sure you've encountered one or two in your time online. There's a study I'm thinking of in YouTube. I can't remember the authors, but it was basically looking at the dark triad. Have you heard of the dark triad of sort of personality characteristics? Mm-hmm. So Machiavellianism,
narcissism, and psychopathy, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So they were showing that in trolls on YouTube comments, these properties were not all of them actually, but I think. I should know that, but it's quite far into the interview now, so my mind's starting to go a bit blank. But I think it was more the psychopathy was a bit higher, and the Machiavellianism. So the narcissism, not so much. So perhaps if people are really narcissistic, they aren't so trolly, because that would might sort of reflect badly on them. They want to sort of maintain a good image or something. But yeah, certainly the psychopathy and Machiavellianism is there, and then they also say so trolls tend to be sadistic. They enjoy causing other people pain, and that's why they do it. They're trying to provoke a reaction. They're trying to make someone lose it and get really upset so that they can laugh at them, basically. And so I think we have to be realistic about human nature. Like not all problems, not all conflicts are just caused by misunderstandings. A lot of conflicts are caused by people who like conflicts, and they go out seeking conflicts. So I think we have to be realistic about that, and think about. I think social networks, the technology companies need to look at ways that they can identify this sort of behavior, and really. It probably has to be automated through AI or something in the future, that they can sort of identify these individuals and take steps to kind of sanction them or isolate them in some way. Mm-hmm. I think they're starting to do that as well. Certainly are starting to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, they are. So you referred to bullies and bullying. When it comes to cyberbullying, do you think that it might be even worse, particularly for children and adolescents, to deal with cyberbullying than traditional bullying? Because I would guess that it's even harder for people, because imagining a situation where a children is a victim of bullying at school. When she gets home, the bullies can no longer reach her. But when it comes to cyberbullying, they are virtually 24/7 exposed to that, if they don't turn off the internet, right?
Yeah, That's definitely one of the things that comes up a lot if you look at kind of qualitative studies of cyberbullying, asking people, what do you find so upsetting about it, is that 24/7 aspect that could contribute, for example, to, there does seem to be quite a lot of cases of suicide that can be related to cyberbullying. Whether, again, it's impossible to say, whether these people wouldn't have committed suicide anyway if they hadn't been cyberbullying, but it certainly does. People will talk about that aspect, that they can never get away from it. There's a couple of other aspects as well which might make it worse. So there's some evidence, not terribly replicated or secure yet, I think, but there's some indications that you might get more individuals engaging in cyberbullying than would engage in face-to-face bullying. So with face-to-face bullying, it tends to be quite physically dominant or socially dominant or physically threatening people who do it, because they're not so afraid of the reaction from the other person. So, they don't care if the other person fights back, because they feel that they're stronger than them. They can deal with it. But in cyberbullying, you can get people joining in who are not so dominant, because they can hide behind that anonymity. So they're not as worried about it. And also,
so we could get that sort of mob effect also because people are anonymous on the internet.
That's also another related aspect. So a lot of people mention that what really bothers them about the cyberbullying is when it goes public. So they can take another person just insulting them. They just say, "Oh, this person's an idiot." But then when it gets their dirty laundry or whatever gets put into public and everyone's laughing at them in the class, that's what really hurts them. If you think of like the Star Wars kid or someone like that whose life was ruined just because someone posted a video of him dancing around with a lightsaber, it's very harsh how this sort of public shaming can happen just for a video or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, even approaching things from a strict biological perspective, when a person or an animal gets bullied, I mean, they have the options of escaping, of hiding, and things like that. But really, through cyberbullying, people can't virtually do that.
Yeah, and it ties into which again might be a specifically or particularly human kind of evolutionary fear that we have, but is this the fear of the group kind of turning against you, so you being isolated, thrown out, or even overwhelmed, murdered by the group. If you look at someone was talking to me the other day about one of the greatest fears people have is fear of public speaking, right? So you can this is actually something social psychologists have used in experiments to induce fear in people, is to imagine that you're giving a talk in front of 100 people that you've only been given 10 minutes to prepare this talk or something. and I think there must be some evolutionary reason for that. Why are we so scared of the group? It's because we're group animals. We have these instincts that encourage us to live in groups, and we depend on the group to survive. If you look at Joe Henrich's theoretical work recently, showing how that's the secret of our success, to live in groups, and therefore to be cast out of the group, to have the group sort of turn against you, is something that's particularly threatening. And that, as you say, cyberbullying would be a great example of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of ingredients here, right? I mean, people, when it comes to speaking in public and when it comes to what they're exposed on the internet, I mean, we are dealing with things that can reduce people's social reputation and even mate value and their fitness. I mean, it can even go down to the core of our biological aspects, let's say.
Yeah, although at the same time, we should say that with cyberbullying, it might not all be worse than traditional bullying, because I think certainly with boys, there's some interviews where people say, actually, I'm more scared of face-to-face bullying because it's physical, right? So, as bad as the cyberbullying gets, you can just ignore it, right? You can just say, this is just some idiot, like, it's just words, it's not going to hurt me. But, I remember a couple of times getting physical bullying at school, and it was terrifying. You really, at a very basic biological level, you fear pain. You don't fear words in the same sort of way. So there is some there is some evidence that face-to-face bullying has gone down. Certainly in terms of physical bullying, is less than it would have been 20 years ago, and it might actually be that cyberbullying is a kind of outlet for that. That aggression has got more indirect as society has changed. In the same way as you've probably seen in some of my work, that as children get older, the aggression tends to get more indirect as well. So it could be as society evolves, aggression, we've moved away from physical aggression and got more into indirect forms of aggression as well, which isn't necessarily a bad thing.
Right. Okay, so Dr. Ingram, we've already done 1 hour. Let's end the interview here. But just before we go, would you like to tell people what are the best online sources for them to know a little bit more about your work? That's
a good question. I've got a couple of preprints out. I don't know, can you put like links in the comments or something like that? With that?
Yes.
I've got a couple of book chapters out recently, which probably the best way to access them is online as a preprint. So there was, particularly I'm thinking of, in an Oxford handbook, I did a chapter recently on how gossip and tattling change as children get older. So some of the ideas I was just talking about now, in terms of it getting more indirect. In terms of cyberpsychology, I had a chapter on evolutionary approaches to cyberpsychology a few years ago. Otherwise it's more of a watch this space really, because I've been collecting some data on cyberpsychology, looking at, for example, adolescents' exposure to risks online and who they tell about those risks, which is quite interesting. So as they get older, they're less likely to talk to adults about it, as in sort of tattling and things, are more likely to talk to their peers. So in terms of percentage of who they're reporting to. So there's a change in the sort of social support group from being supported by parents and teachers to being supported by other peers. That's not, I'm presenting that at a conference, cyberpsychology conference in June, and then I'll try and write that up into articles. So it's a bit of a watch this space, I'm afraid, but I'll try and get preprints up as soon as the article's ready.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So, Dr. Ingram, thank you a lot again for taking the time to be on the show, and it was really a pleasure to have you and to talk with you.
The pleasure is all mine. Thanks for a really interesting interview, and you've actually given me some ideas to think about as well. I'll enjoy watching the interview and trying to think about how I could use these to help with research designs and things. So thanks a lot, Ricardo. And cheers. I'll make sure to follow your other interviews as well. Very impressive list of guests you've had.
Hello everybody, thank you so much for coming to my channel and for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel on February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would really like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even $1, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. You also have the alternative of supporting me on Subscribestar or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons, Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Peruga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelina, Jim Frank, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Condriano, Jan Haninen, and my 2 producers. These are Webb and Rosie. Thank you for all.